Good morning. Welcome to Chewing the Gristle. This is a poetry chat with Al Black and my co-host, the poet Tim Conroy. Welcome, Tim.
My brother Al, how you doing today?
Great, great. How's Florida?
Yeah, it's going to be a warm week down here. It's great.
I'm jealous. We want to welcome our poet today. Our poet is our friend and the poet, Elizabeth Robin. Welcome, Elizabeth.
Hi, good to be here.
Elizabeth Robin, a retired high school teacher, has two collections of poetry through Finishing Line Press, Where Green Meets Blue, 2018, and Silk Purses and Lemonade, 2017. A third, To My Dream Catcher, will be out in 2021. A poet of witness and discovery, she relates both true and fictional stories about her low country presence and world traveling past. The 2021 winner of the Poetry Society of South Carolina's John Edward Johnson Prize, Robin appears most recently in Drunk Monkeys, the Broadkill Review, I Am Not a Silent Poet, Blue Mountain Review, Good Juju, The Fourth River, Foliate Oak, and Reflections. Robin MCs a monthly open mic and partners with arts groups to bring literary programs to Hilton Head Island. Can you start by explaining or talking about your journey as a poet? Who were your early influences and how did you become a poet?
Uh, I don't know.
Something simple like that.
I just don't know. The journey was a long one. I didn't really legitimately write my first poem until I was 58 years old. I always thought of myself as a nonfiction writer and actually wanted to be a novelist. That was my goal when I retired. But I was a high school English teacher for 33 years and always loved reading. I read everything. I still do. I don't just read poetry, but poetry changed for me when I was teaching in New Jersey. There's a very active organization there called the Dodge Poetry Foundation. They have wonderful programs every 2 years, but they also have a program for teachers. I'm going to get the name wrong. It's something like Tend the Spring, Do Something with the Fountain. I can't remember how it goes. It's an odd moniker, but teachers can sign up for this. It's free. It's a weekly workshop with a real poet. And it was really my first working with a working poet. And I worked with a gentleman named Charles Johnson, who was also a journalist. And he did one of those programs where he took his poetry and worked with prison inmates in the Newark area. And he was wonderful. And the biggest thing he brought me to was poetry is not something you should be reading. It's something you should be hearing. And I completely changed the way I taught poetry after having that was basically one semester of workshops. And that kind of brought me back to revisiting all of the poetry that I love that I've been teaching for, at that point, decades. I think poets like Gwendolyn Brooks, Lucille Clifton, E. Cummings, T.S. Elliot, those were big ones for me. Langston Hughes, poets that are all very different in what they do and the way that they do it, but they tell a great story. And they do it in beautiful and inventive ways. And that is what I appreciate in a poem.
Hey, Elizabeth, I always like to ask people about their formal writing process. Do you write every day? Do you write at night? Do you write in the morning after walks, after wine? Do you write with a pencil? Do you keyboard? How do you do your writing?
I wasn't expecting you to ask that question, but this is the current journal. And you'll notice this one is kind of like a purse. So I can keep my pen in it. And this journal actually is the one that I had with me when I was doing my travels with Byron. I'm down to the last. But anytime, I don't know, I'm always thinking, and I take really long walks every day. My dog needs exercise, and so do I. I kind of get nuts if I can't. And something about being out in nature and walking and just emptying your head. I've never been a person to, like, I used to be a runner. I never used to, back in the Walkman days, I didn't do that. No, this was my time to be in my head. And it's always been like that. So I get ideas, I come home, I spill them out. I wake up, the journals at my bedside, I spill them out. Sometimes it's just a word, sometimes it's an idea, a list, sometimes some kind of a poem happens. But poetry for me is hard. It takes me a long time to end up with a poem, and I'll find fragments of poems. I'll go back and I'll go, wait a minute, that idea that was like 10 pages ago is actually, it's the same train of thought as this one right here. And then I start, that's how I kind of put it together. It's like a puzzle. It's like, I don't know what's in my head and I need to spill it out so I don't lose that idea, that phrase. And then somewhere along the line is, oh, that's what I'm thinking about. That's what that means. And then I start working from there. So at some point it leaves the journal and ends up on my laptop. And usually what determines that is how messy it gets. There'll be a point where it's just untenable and I can't even see what I've got unless I get it somewhere clean and start working with it. Plus on a computer, it's easier to flip things around and start to play. So, yeah.
That's great.
I love poetry though. I've always preferred things that challenge me. It's why I ended up not really going into, say, the maths. Math was something that for me was very simple and it had an answer and it bored me. And it bored me very quickly. But literature, there's never an answer. There's always another way of seeing it. Every time you look at something, you see something else. And it's a series of truths. And the older that you get, and the more experience you have, the more you bring to what you get out of something. And I just think that's really wonderful. And with poetry, I mean, that's why you can revisit it. A novel, I never reread novels. Once you know the story, you know the story. I'll reread pieces that are prettily written, but why read the story again? I know what happens. But poems, there's always something new. There's always something where you go, whoa, why didn't I see that before? They're a wonderful little piece of our culture, I think.
Well, Elizabeth, talk to us a little bit about your poetry collections, and you maybe talk and explain the cohesion of both collections. Talk about the differences of Silk Purses and Lemonade and Where Green Meets Blue?
Well, I mentioned I didn't really start writing poetry until I was 58. And what happened that year was my brother got sick. And I mean, he was my only sibling. And he did die two years later. So it was very difficult for me. And, normally when I'm going through something, I write about it, and I write nonfiction, an essay, something like that. And what kept spilling out was poems, those, those awful emo poems that your teenage students will write sometimes. That's what a lot of them were sometimes. I mean, those are, those are buried somewhere. But eventually what I learned, and eventually I had a little collection that would be a chapbook length, and there are contests for that. And I'm like, okay, let me try. Cause my critique group was telling me that, I really should pursue it. And I'm like, okay, you say so, we'll try. And I pursued it with the first one, Silk Purses and Lemonade. The title comes from the idea of, that whole thing that, we can look at our difficulties and our tragedies and just constantly be, oh, woe is me, and be miserable and never do anything with our lives again. And, we know people that do that make that choice, or you can choose somehow to make that the foundation of a new way to be. And so I chose to make lemonade. So Silk Purses and Lemonade is all about traveling that process of, how all of us navigate disappointment, tragedy, difficulty, all those things that all of us experience. It's not like my experiences are new. It's not like there isn't anybody else out there that's gone through the wonderful series of things that I have. What's interesting is Silk Purses, it was rejected a lot because I didn't really understand what a chapbook should be. And it does kind of need to tell a story. And as soon as I understood, it needs to hang together in some way. And then I realized that that's what hung it together. So that's how that happened. And I actually, my late husband had been my first reader for all of those poems, except the first one and the last one in that collection. And when I finally submitted it, I had written those, and the first one and the first one I wrote when he was in the hospital. This was like a year after my brother died. And he was in the hospital, and I wrote the first one about what it's like to, be in those moments in your life where you're suspended, you're waiting. And, I was sitting next to him, and I never showed this to him. It wasn't something he needed to see, but, that whole idea that we get in these moments where we're just waiting to see what's going to happen. Where are we going to be? How is this going to play out? Right. And the last one is Bonsai. Was one of our students had sent us a bonsai tree. And I had been reading about, how you cultivate the bonsai and stuff. And it just, after my husband died, it just fit the whole widow experience right away for me. It was like, because people treat you so differently, so immediately. And it's like, how am I going to navigate this? Because just because I'm a widow doesn't mean that I'm not still me. It's my circumstance. It's not who I am. And so, there was that. And that's when it finally got picked up. Was when I put in those two poems. So that's when I understood, it had to have this clear beginning, this clear end. It had to have a storyline. So when I got to Where Green Meets Blue, which came out, this was like a boom, boom, someone that wasn't a poet then then has a chapbook and then gets another one right away. And Where Green Meets Blue was really my homage to him, to my husband, and to the place that we had retired to and that he loved so much. And the story there is about affirmation, I think. I was sad. I still am, because I miss him. I loved him. We had a wonderful thing. And that's something to celebrate. That's not something to mourn.
Well,
Sorry.
Let's hear a couple poems.
Oh, okay. From Where Green Meets Blue, I part of it is navigating solitude, and what you learn to pay attention to, which I think is something. I think that's what a poet is, right? Someone that pays attention differently. So there's this wonderful place. My son lives in Birmingham, in England, and so when I visit them often, they're working, they're at school, all this kind of stuff, and I hang out at a coffee shop. And my favorite coffee shop on their street is called the Arco Lounge. And so I'm sitting there one day, and this is what I wrote. At the Arco Lounge, I sit in solitude, surrounded, looped into the Motown track, dancing lanterns light the ceiling. My eyes gravitate to a black and white perm woman in cat's eye glasses, kissing a parakeet. Her ecstasy draws me back again and again. Blown out of proportion, she looms above table 20, a portent perhaps of joy, even as gray skies wet passers-by, a constant scrim when stuck in the Arco Lounge in the rain. The buzz of conversation mutes Smokey and Michael and Gladys as coffee shop companions sipping hot chocolate and news feeds pause. She glows in one simple moment. I stare, bemused, lost in questions and the comfortable routine of lonely thoughts, unvoiced at a table for one.
Yeah, that's beautiful. How about another?
Well, this is the title poem to Silk Purses and Lemonade. I think my subtext to this would be to young poets: don't be afraid of what you're thinking. Don't be afraid to be crazy. Don't be afraid to go out there. These were lines that kept coming to me and coming to me and coming to me, and I didn't really know what was going on in my head at all, which will make sense when you hear the poem. It's just about navigating and addressing absence. Silk purses. Maybe if I shave my legs, spring will come. I daintily sidestep around my confusion. I climb through the blurred, darkened opening. Eating words for breakfast, the edges of my mind feel sharpened like a ribbon shredding oyster shell. Awake, I realize my facelessness. Maybe he's in Cars Land, driving through jaw-dropping red rock cliffs, or Dismal Land, where Cinderella crashes and he burns. Or maybe he's still here in some alternate plane where leaving without a word seems civilized, simple, kind. He's still not here, only his ghost in random misplaced socks, the suit stored in the back closet. I will spin a gossamer sheen of silk, a veil masking sorrow and joy, build a compact purse, compress my world to fit inside his, into the eminent domain of spectral territory. I'll open that silk purse and cram it with laughs, stuff in cries until life bursts its cloture, and everything actually has a reason. Sand works the oyster, and I become the pearl, made by Disney, scripted in Hollywood, a dreamscape approved for mass production.
That's an excellent poem. There's 2 or 3 lines in there that just resonate, and you start with one of the best ones.
Thank you. Now that one, that one always made me giggle when it came into my head, and I'd be like, I got to use that somewhere, and then I found where.
You've touched on it a little bit, but talk to us about revision, how you go about revision, and is a poem ever really finished?
Interestingly enough, I just dropped a line from the Arco Lounge on purpose, because when I was choosing what to read today, I was like, why is that there? You know, it's like you change. I mean, I hopefully you grow, hopefully you improve, right? So I look at things now and I'm like, sometimes I don't like what I wrote 5, 6, 7 years ago. It's just not, it's not as sharp. You know, so hopefully I'm getting better. But yeah, rewriting is, you know, I used to teach my students that little phrase, writing is rewriting. And you asked me earlier, do I write every day? No. But I'm doing something in writing every day, yes. And a lot of it is editing. You know, right now I'm working on editing 2 different things, the book that's coming out, To My Dreamcatcher, and I wrote the story of my trip with Byron, Travels with Byron, which I'm getting ready to query, and you know, it's gone through 1 round of critique group, and now it needs work. You know, it's not telling right now the story I want to tell, and that's the point, isn't it? You need to get it to the point where it's the voice that you want to be speaking in, and, you know, all those things.
Who is the poet Elizabeth Robin reading today? Who is firing your creative juices?
I've been reading a lot of Mary Oliver. Don't know why. I took a workshop with Maggie Smith a year ago. I've been reading a lot of her stuff. And I've been going back through a lot of E.E. Cummings. He's a puzzle to me. Yeah, he's a puzzle to me. He is, you know, a World War I veteran. He had been a prisoner of war, and yet so much of his poetry is so joyful. And I'm like, what? How do you do that? You know, very interesting man. And I've been going through the local thrift shop one day had an entire shelf that apparently was from someone's estate. And so for 50 cents a piece, I got first editions of like Maya Angelou and there's Houseman and William Carlos Williams. And I mean, it's amazing. I got like 30 poetry books. I've been going through those. But, you know, I read poetry every day, but just like a poem. And then, you know, I digest it. I'm not I used to be one of those readers that would read like 3 books in a day. Yeah. I didn't socialize much in my youth. I was the one in the corner reading. I was the one in the classroom with a book in my lap, not really paying attention to anything that was going on in the classroom. I was reading. But now I find that I take like a month to read a book. I'm reading right now. Right now, I'm reading a book called Blue Highways, and it's a story of a road trip on back roads, blue highways. Not with his dog. He does it by himself in a van. But yeah, he's traveling a lot of the places that I went with my dog, and I'm enjoying it. His story is different from mine. He's telling a different story than I'm telling, but I'm enjoying his story.
Well, talking about stories, share a couple more poems.
Okay. Well, I think one of the things that I like to do is I love language. So this is going to be in the new collection. And I told you sometimes what I do in journals is make lists. And there was a day that I just started listing all these different oxymorons. I love oxymorons. I think they're very funny. It's like nerdy humor. And I decided at some point that I could make a poem out of it. And then in the last year, I started dating. And what can be more humorous than someone my age? Yeah. So the oxymorons and the dating, it kind of went together. And this has to do with like when you first introduce someone to your children who are no longer children. My children are like, they range from 28 to 40 now. So yeah, real fun. So the past meets the present. Silver dating for oxymorons. Act natural, she says, as she pokes my side. The sharp elbow separates ribs, deflates a lung. In one deft motion, none notice. Passive aggressive takes another passenger on the train that requires no ticket, no passport, no reservations. Just war, this struggle to swell impressions. In a small crowd of adult children, alone together, they could not shake the stillness of living death. I write a lot about relationships. They're important to me. And I choose my relationships more carefully than a lot of people. My brother was one of those gregarious, outgoing extroverts that, is always surrounded by people. He was a very popular, well-liked guy. I have a small, yeah. But I never have written much about my family. And so I wrote this. 1966. A refrigerator-sized jukebox crammed with oldies makes the diner a destination. We beg Dad for nickels, choose our favorite 3 hits. Mom shimmies her shoulders to the beat. Yeah, boots were made for walking into it. And I realize she knows the words. I wonder what that means. This woman wearing bell-bottoms in public before, always in hat, heels, gloves, nylons. I'm talking pre-pantyhose, hitched thigh-high to a garter belt. I am 12, trying to be mom, embrace pop songs, bust past Broadway show tunes and classical piano. 3 years after MLK marches on DC, 2 since Johnson signed civil rights into law. A year we all sang "The times they are a-changin'" and knew that meant a better world a-comin'. And here she is in her broad striped colorful pants, glancing glint in her eye at Dad, belting out, "Gonna walk all over you." And Dad's just grinning like he'd enjoy a few deep heel marks. And I wonder what that means. Talk turns to how Nancy has this hit because, well, Frank, she's a middling talent after all, says my mother. And my father just glows and stairs.
Let's dig into your craft a little bit, Elizabeth, and talk about the poetic elements you love to use. And do you do much research for your poems? Do you collect words? You talk a little bit about whether you use rhyme and how you use it. I know your diction is incredible in your poems. So talk a little bit about poetic element.
For the most part, you have to work to your strength. I find things like rhyme very difficult. So you don't find them much in my work. I just can't figure it out. Sometimes I can do internal rhymes. I work a lot with sound and rhythm. I read stuff aloud constantly because it needs to sound the way I want it to sound, and that might be where the diction comes from. I switch out a lot of words until I get the word that works with the sound that I want. So there's that. But research, I go through all kinds of rabbit hole situations because, you get involved with wanting to find out more about something. I remember, especially with poems that involve some kind of world news, political kind of situation. I write a lot of those. Environmental, eco-friendly green stuff. I write a lot of those, and I may not necessarily know all the information I should know. And so then I'll find myself going and taking a look at things. There was a painting I actually bought it. It's in my living room that a friend of mine did of rice fields in South Carolina. And, I'm not from South Carolina, but I knew that rice was like the big crop that economically launched South Carolina in, colonial times to the economic power that it was, especially the Charleston area and that port. But I kept staring at that painting and I wanted to write about it. And somehow or other, I ended up writing about the history of South Carolina rice, about which I did not know that much, So, I knew pieces of history just because, some of them parallel Virginia, which is where I am from. So in terms of the slave trade and that kind of thing, there was a history there as well, obviously. But some things I had to research. So I ended up doing 2-3 weeks of research before I actually went back and worked that poem. And that was just one poem. That poem took me a long time.
In terms of, I know you write a lot of different sort of poetic styles, but you do tend to write a lot of narrative poetry.
Mm-hmm.
In your narrative poetry, talk a little bit about how you work your line breaks in your openings, what you think about your openings, what you think about your end.
Well, the trick is to get the whole story without using many words. So it's a paring down. I start with a lot more often and just until it's minimal. And my dear friend Miho Kinnas is a wonderful help with that because she's a very minimal, spare poet. She comes from a completely different aesthetic than I do. And I don't know how often she's just drawn a line across my poems and gone, "You could stop there." And I'm like, "What? But this stuff over here is so good." And she's like, "No, you can stop there. You told the whole story right there." And I'm like, "Okay." I've gotten used to being okay with that, but it was very painful at first. But you have to learn to let go. It's kind of a good metaphor for life, isn't it? But yeah, I think a lot about beginnings. I think a lot about, a poem is different. It isn't a place where you can spend time unfolding. It isn't like A Tale of Two Cities where you start into this the whole entire first page, which is one sentence, by the way. It was the best of times, it was worst of times, it was this, it was that, it was this, it was that. And it was like, good Lord, you can't do that in a poem. You got to get to it. So, how do you get to it? How do you get to the crux? And I think the biggest thing I learned is, what is it that you were feeling or thinking? Sometimes you don't know that when you first write. And you have to find that. And that's what takes so long. Sometimes I have things that are sitting and have been sitting for literally years now. And I just don't know what it is that made me write it. It's not a poem yet, though. It's got good stuff in it, but I don't know what it means. And until I figure that out, it's just not there.
As a poet and as a former teacher, are there resources that you recommend or refer to as far as the craft of poetry?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Actually, Tim warned me that you were going to ask me that one, by the way. So I have a pile. I heard there had to be show and tell on this one. But yeah, okay. I can go way back. Well, first of all, the one I can't find is the book that I counted on more than anything else myself. And always was the handbook I gave my students, and that's Strunk and White's Elements of Style. There really isn't a more well laid out piece for any kind of writing than that one. I mean, just it does it so simply and cleanly, and the rules are true. But I don't know where that book. I think I lost that in the last move. I can't find it. So, well, welcome to my world, Tim. But this is an old one. This actually was my brother's, but of course he didn't care about it. He was a business major, and this book, it's one of many, and there are many wonderful ones. This isn't necessarily definitive, but where it gives you selections of poems and deconstructs them for you. And talks about what's in there and what it means and how it's put together. And, that I think this was my introduction to a lot of poetry terms as well.
Who edited that copy of Monica?
Maynard Mack, Leonard Dean, and William Frost. And I used it all the time. And I don't think my brother ever knew I took it. Another one, this one I discovered, this guy, James Moffat, Teaching the Universe of Discourse, was something that was pointed out to me when I won a fellowship after my first year of teaching. And it was basically the fellowship for the Bay Area Project, if you remember that movement in teaching, which really, I think, transformed teaching writing for your basic English teacher. But Moffat goes through a whole thing on discourse and stuff, and it's really has a wonderful way of helping you look at the different ways that you can approach a piece of writing and deconstruct a piece of writing. And I used that a ton. I used it a lot to create writing assignments. See, now I'm giving away my secrets. And of course, I always used E.B. White, not just Strunk and White, but in terms of his reader. Now, this one was introduced to me very late in my life. And I think it's recognizable to most, but he's who I read right when I was beginning to write poetry. And so that, that was what, 8 years ago. And, man, oh man, he tells me I can't use adjectives and adverbs almost out of the box. And, I thought that, the best, liveliest writing was just packed with adjectives and adverbs. I use a lot of them. And, like all the things that he talks about, but he's right. He's right. The second that I started thinking about things the way that he talked about, using concrete verbs and nouns. And I took this wonderful workshop with Jeffrey Levine, who's connected to Tupelo Press. And Jeffrey talked about, when, we were reading a Seamus Heaney poem at the time. And one of my classmates points out that he has used an adjective. And Jeffrey just looks up and goes, and why does it work? And And we're looking at it, and it worked because it was a concrete, lively verb that had been turned into an adjective in that particular line. And that's why it worked. And we're like, all right. And of course, this, which Al knows I was just using for the series of lessons that Miho and I and Lisa were doing for Beaufort County Schools. Because she does, she has a wonderful way of, and this is just about poetry. So it's the others are good for any writer, I think. One of the things that I hate the most about having books of poetry or bringing a poem to a workshop or critique group is having someone who's a writer say, I don't really have anything to say. I don't think you can edit poetry. I don't understand poetry. I don't, all this, it's not accessible, because I think it's the most accessible form that we have. It's supposed to be something that immediately speaks to a person. May not speak to all people, but
well, speak to us again with a couple poems. Tell the listeners after you read the poems how they can get hold of your collection.
This one is also going to be in the new book, and it's called Ephemera. I still eat fish on Friday, wipe the toaster top clean and shiny, but never check the crumb tray. Rituals woven like a daisy chain tiara, raining soft petals, shards that wither and crumble, and solidify only in dreams where crados waft in pink noise beyond reach, so concrete. His ghost snores in the guest room, his face, his voice sharpen into crawling clock faces. I dissolve in new memories, languid family hikes to the pub, building dens in fairy groves, dancing on bars, doling out shots to nude men. Moments do not rewind. What lasts? Flatlining as Miles Davis plays Autumn Leaves. But the crunch underfoot hangs out of earshot, and I can't feel the cool, crisp air.
That's lovely.
This book is what hangs it together is it's about the many permutations of dreams. And this one I wrote for a friend, so it's dedicated for Nicole. And I call it, this one actually closes the new book. Paper thin. Paper comes with rules, size and shape, lines spaced in precision, marching down 11 lockstep inches, ruled. No variation accepted, 1-inch margins expected. Only holes wiggle from none to 3 or 5, identical in size, as though every hole measures equally. What spills on each page proves a different truth. Messy stains, altered pulp, fading margins, words bust right through. Proof some lines can't hold and holes can punch you. I choose unlined sheets, letter paper, blank, grained, textured, deckled in pale shades, lively patterns, and escape the margins others draw to shrink my story. My books are available if you go to Finishing Line Press. There's a bookstore, and my 2 books are there. And they have over 3,000 titles of poetry. There are a lot of wonderful poets there. You could have a lot of fun. They're also available on Amazon and at a bunch of different bookstores if you live in my area of Beaufort County, even in Savannah, the Book Lady bookstore.
Wonderful. Well, We're coming to the end of this interview, and we want to thank our friend, the poet, the maven of Hilton Head poetry, Elizabeth Robin. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It's good to see you too.